Alright, let's go. Number 10, the 4.2 kiloyear event. In 1993, archaeologist Harvey Weiss at Yale University published findings in Science that the archaeological establishment found genuinely uncomfortable. His team had been excavating Tel Leilan in northern Syria, a city of 10,000 people that had functioned continuously for 5 centuries. It was abandoned in a single generation. No evidence of warfare, no evidence of disease, no evidence of famine in the usual sense, just an abrupt end and a layer of wind-blown dust covering everything. Weiss proposed a single cause, a catastrophic drought lasting 300 years, had simultaneously collapsed civilizations across 3 continents. The academic consensus rejected this. Then the evidence kept coming in. Around 2200 BCE, something changed in Earth's climate. Oxygen isotope ratios in stalagmites from caves in Oman, China, and South America. 3 regions with no shared agriculture, no shared language, no shared trade network. All show the same disruption at the same time. This is not coincidence. This is a planetary signal. The event lasted roughly 300 years. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Akkadian Empire, the world's first multi-ethnic empire, spanning 800,000 square kilometers and governed by a centralized bureaucracy sophisticated enough to issue standardized weights and measures, simply ceased to function. Cities that had been continuously inhabited for 1,000 years were abandoned. Grain stores emptied. Administrative texts abruptly stopped being written. The last known inscription from the Akkadian imperial period describes food prices so high they are no longer in recognizable units. Simultaneously, in Egypt, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The pharaoh no longer had sufficient grain to maintain a centralized state. Nomarchs, regional governors, stopped deferring to Memphis. A text from the period, known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, describes a world turned upside down. The river is blood. Men shrink from tasting it. The land is ruined. The nobles lament. The gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. All is ruin. For decades, Egyptologists read Ipuwer as a literary hyperbole. The paleoclimatological record suggests it was reporting accurately. In the Indus Valley, more than 3,000 kilometers from Mesopotamia and more than 4,000 kilometers from Egypt, the Harappan civilization, home to an estimated 5 million people and the most advanced urban planning system in the ancient world, began its terminal decline. Cities that had maintained standardized brick sizes and sophisticated drainage systems for centuries were progressively abandoned. The population moved southeast toward the coast. The heartland of one of the 3 largest civilizations on Earth was emptied within 2 generations. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. These 3 civilizations had no meaningful contact with each other. There is no evidence they traded in significant volume, shared military alliances, or coordinated politically. A drought that affected only one region would have been devastating. A drought that simultaneously collapsed 3 entirely separate civilizations across 2 continents suggests something operating at a planetary scale, a shift in atmospheric circulation patterns so fundamental that it shut down monsoon systems from the Middle East to South Asia. The truly disturbing aspect is not the scale, it is the speed. Societies that had maintained populations in the millions for centuries collapsed within a human lifetime. The administrative infrastructure of 3 civilizations, their grain stores, their writing systems, their standardized weights, their urban planning, all of it went silent within roughly 2 generations. People who were born into functioning empires died in a world that had no functioning states. The paleoclimatological record is now clear. The 4.2 kiloyear event was real. It was global. And it was not the only time this happened. The geological record shows that the climate systems capable of producing a 300-year drought affecting 3 continents simultaneously are the same systems operating today. The Saharan-Arabian dust signal that marks the 4.2 KY event in the stalagmite records, that same signal appears at other points in the Holocene. Weaker, stronger, never fully absent. The mechanism that collapsed the Akkadian Empire did not disappear in 1900 BCE. It went quiet, and climate systems do not retire. They wait. Number 9, the Thera Eruption. In 1967, Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavating a site on the island of Santorini beneath 30 meters of volcanic ash. What he found was Akkadian, a Minoan town preserved in extraordinary detail. Multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing, drainage systems under the streets, beds with sleeping mats still arranged inside rooms, ceramic storage vessels still containing food. The inhabitants had evacuated. They had taken their valuables. But they had left everything too heavy to carry, and the ash preserved it all. The question Marinatos could not answer was simpler and more devastating. Where did they go? No Akkadian refugees have ever been found. The eruption that buried Akkadian occurred around 1628 BCE. Estimates of its magnitude have been revised upward consistently over the past 3 decades. The most recent research places it at a volcanic explosivity index of 6 to 7, making it one of the most powerful eruptions in the last 5,000 years. The eruption ejected an estimated 60 to 100 cubic kilometers of magma, ash, and pyroclastic material. The collapse of the volcanic cone created a caldera, a depression in the Earth's surface, nearly 12 kilometers wide and 400 meters deep, which still forms the outline of the modern Santorini island group. The tsunami generated by the caldera collapse has been estimated at heights of between 35 and 150 meters on nearby coastlines. Geological surveys of the island of Crete, approximately 120 kilometers to the south, have identified tsunami deposit layers dating to the Thera event across multiple sites on the northern coast. Debris transported by the wave has been found more than 25 kilometers inland at elevations above 80 meters. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The Minoan civilization did not collapse immediately. Archaeological evidence shows continued occupation of the major palace centers, Knossos, Phaistos, Zakros, for decades after the eruption. What the eruption appears to have done is something more insidious than direct destruction. It destabilized the agricultural and trading infrastructure that made Minoan civilization viable. Ashfall across the eastern Mediterranean disrupted harvests for years. The loss of the Thera colony, a critical node in the Minoan trade network, created an economic shock from which recovery proved impossible. Within a century of the eruption, the Minoan palace system, which had organized Aegean civilization for roughly 600 years, was gone. The linear A writing system, which had administered the palace economies, ceased to be produced. It has never been deciphered. Every administrative record of the Minoan civilization, its economics, its legal codes, its religious texts, its correspondence, remains locked in a script that no living person can read. The truly disturbing aspect is not the eruption. It is what was permanently erased. Linear A represents a minimum of 2 to 3 centuries of administrative development. The people who wrote in it were operating sophisticated palace economies with standardized accounting systems. Whatever they knew about their history, their religion, their understanding of the world, it is inaccessible. The eruption did not just collapse a civilization, it ensured that we would never understand it. And Santorini is not extinct. The Kamini Islands inside the Santorini caldera are active volcanic structures. The most recent eruption occurred in 1950. Geodetic surveys show the caldera floor inflating at measurable rates. The system that produced a VEI-7 eruption in 1628 BCE is not dormant, it is recharging. Number 8. The Bronze Age collapse. In 1939, archaeologist Claude Schaefer began excavating the ruins of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a major Bronze Age trading city that had maintained continuous occupation for nearly 3,000 years. In one of the city's final levels, he found a clay tablet that had been baked in the fire that destroyed the city. The tablet was a letter. Its sender was the governor of Alashia, the ancient name for Cyprus. Its message read, "My father, there is famine in my house. We will all die of hunger. If you do not come quickly, we shall die. You should know that." The response, if there was one, was never sent. The city was destroyed before it could be dispatched. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age Mediterranean experienced what archaeologist Eric Klein at George Washington University has called a systems collapse. Spate. Within a 50-year window, roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, the following disappeared. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled Anatolia for 500 years. Mycenaean Greece, whose palace centers at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were burned and never reoccupied. The Ugarit trading network, the Egyptian Palatine system in Canaan, and the Kassite dynasty in Babylon. More than 50 cities across the eastern Mediterranean were destroyed or abandoned in a single human lifetime. Archaeological surveys of the destruction layers at these sites show evidence of multiple simultaneous stressors. Burn marks consistent with military destruction alternate with evidence of gradual abandonment. Storage magazines emptied in some cases, suggesting planned evacuation. In others, grain was left in storage jars, suggesting catastrophic, sudden departure. Letters from Ugarit's final years describe attacks from unknown raiders, the Sea Peoples, whose identity remains debated, while simultaneously describing internal food shortages so severe that the palace was unable to feed its own administrative staff. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The Sea Peoples' hypothesis that nomadic raiders triggered the collapse fails to account for simultaneous independent failures in regions the Sea Peoples never reached. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest documented Sea People activity, collapsed at the same time. Recent paleoclimatological research, including pollen analysis from Lake Van in eastern Turkey and isotope data from cave formations across the Levant, shows a severe drought signal beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting approximately 150 years. This is the same climatic mechanism that operated 1,000 years earlier during the 4.2 kiloyear event. The truly disturbing aspect is not the destruction. It is the silence that followed. In Greece, literacy disappeared for approximately 400 years. The palace administrative system that had supported linear B writing, the Mycenaean script, simply ceased to exist. When writing reappears in Greece around 800 BCE, it uses a completely different alphabet derived from Phoenician. The administrative knowledge, the trade contacts, the religious traditions of Mycenaean civilization are known to us only through fragments and through myths transmitted orally across 4 centuries of illiteracy. The climate systems that produced the Bronze Age collapse have been documented to recur. The drought pattern visible in sediment cores from Lake Van follows what appear to be irregular periodicities in regional climate cycles. The 3.2 kiloyear event was not an anomaly. It was one data point in a recurring pattern. The next data point in that pattern is not somewhere in the remote geological future. Based on cycle periodicity, it falls within a range that includes the current century. Number 7, the Black Sea flood. In 1993, oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman aboard the research vessel Canoe deployed deepwater sonar arrays across the floor of the Black Sea and recovered something that challenged the academic consensus about the most recent chapter of European prehistory. Beneath 150 meters of saltwater, they found a shoreline. A complete ancient coastline, with river channels, beaches, and submerged features consistent with human habitation. The shoreline was intact. It had not eroded because it had been flooded suddenly, too quickly for wave action to modify it. The date of the flooding, based on radiocarbon analysis of freshwater mollusk shells from the ancient shoreline, approximately 5,600 BCE. At that date, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake isolated from the Mediterranean by a land bridge at the Bosphorus Strait. Its surface was approximately 80 to 150 meters below current sea level. The land surrounding it was inhabitable. In fact, exceptionally habitable. A freshwater lake the size of a small sea, in a temperate climate, surrounded by fertile plains, represents exactly the kind of environment where early agricultural communities would settle and expand. The population of the Black Sea Basin in 5,600 BCE, based on archaeological evidence from sites now at the margins of the lake's extent, was substantial. Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis, published in their 1997 book and subsequently in peer-reviewed form in Marine Geology, proposed that rising Mediterranean sea levels, driven by continued post-glacial meltwater input, eventually overtopped the Bosphorus land bridge. The initial breach, once started, was self-reinforcing. As the gap eroded wider, flow rates increased, driving faster erosion in a positive feedback cycle. Their calculations suggested that at peak flow, the discharge rate through the Bosphorus reached the equivalent of 200 Niagara Falls. The Black Sea's surface level rose at a rate of approximately 15 centimeters per day. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. 15 centimeters per day sounds gradual. Over months, it is not. An agricultural community living at the margins of a freshwater lake, their fields, their storage facilities, their irrigation channels at water level, would have had to move every few weeks, then every few days, then daily. A shoreline that receded gradually at first would eventually advance rapidly enough that retreat became impossible. Ryan and Pittman estimated the total land area inundated at approximately 155,000 square kilometers. That is a land area roughly the size of Bangladesh, entirely submerged in months. The truly disturbing aspect is the genetic and mythological record. DNA analysis of populations from the Black Sea Basin shows a dispersal event occurring around 5,500 to 6,000 BCE, consistent with a mass migration of agricultural communities into Central Europe, the Aegean, and the Middle East. The refugees from the Black Sea flood are, in a direct genetic sense, the ancestors of a significant proportion of present-day Europeans. And nearly every ancient culture that traces its origins to this diaspora carries a story about a catastrophic flood that destroyed the world. The Mesopotamian flood narrative, the biblical account of Noah, the Greek myth of Deucalion. Cultures separated by thousands of kilometers with no documented contact, describing the same event, a world-ending inundation that spared only those who fled in time. The Black Sea Basin is now saltwater. The agricultural civilization that occupied its shores is 150 meters underwater across 155,000 square kilometers. As of the last published survey, less than 1% of the submerged shoreline has been archaeologically investigated. Number 6, the Storegga submarine landslide. On the night the North Atlantic changed, there was no warning, no earthquake large enough to be widely felt above the waterline, no eruption, no storm. In the winter of approximately 6,100 BCE, on the continental shelf approximately 100 kilometers off the western coast of Norway, an area of seafloor the size of Iceland simply let go. 300 kilometers of slope sheared away in a matter of minutes, displacing 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment. a volume greater than the combined annual discharge of every river on Earth into the deep Atlantic basin. The Storegga slide is one of the largest submarine landslides documented in the geological record, and it did not occur in empty water. The tsunami generated by this event has been reconstructed from sediment cores taken across the North Sea basin, the Scottish coast, and the Norwegian coast. Along the Norwegian coast, run-up heights reach 20 to 25 meters. Along the Shetland Islands, wave deposits have been identified at elevations up to 25 meters above current sea level. In the Faroe Islands, marine sediments were deposited 12 meters above any previous high water mark. The wave traveled at an estimated 700 kilometers per hour, reaching Scotland in under 2 hours. What makes the Storegga slide distinctively catastrophic in human terms is what occupied the region it struck. In 6100 BCE, the area now called the North Sea was not open water. It was Doggerland, a landmass the size of modern Germany, formed by the falling sea levels of the last glacial maximum and gradually shrinking since the end of the Ice Age. Doggerland was some of the richest hunting and fishing territory in post-glacial Europe. Dense forests, freshwater lakes, river systems, and coastal wetlands supporting a substantial Mesolithic population. Archaeological evidence for Doggerland's human occupation comes from fishing trawls that have recovered Mesolithic tools, bone fragments, and, in 2009, a fragment of what appears to be worked wood from the bed of the southern North Sea. Research published in Earth Science Reviews in 2020 estimated that the tsunami generated by the Storegga slide reached Doggerland at heights of 5 to 10 meters across its coastal areas. The interior was flooded from the coast simultaneously. The event did not drown Doggerland entirely. It was already shrinking from rising sea levels. But the Storegga tsunami appears to have accelerated that process decisively. The coastal areas most densely populated were destroyed in a single night. The survivors retreated to progressively higher ground as sea levels continued to rise over subsequent centuries, until by approximately 5000 BCE, Doggerland had been entirely submerged. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The Storegga slide is classified as a historical event, past, resolved, unlikely to recur. The Norwegian Geotechnical Institute has published surveys of the current state of the Norwegian continental margin. Their findings are not comforting. The same sediment accumulation processes that produced the Storegga slide are still active. The margin is still accumulating sediment at the same rates as before the previous collapse. Sediment wedges on oversteepened slopes fail. They fail every few thousand years. The previous Storegga event occurred approximately 6100 BCE. Its predecessor occurred approximately 30,000 years before that. The truly disturbing aspect is the present-day infrastructure. Major submarine cable networks connecting North American and European internet infrastructure run across the floor of the North Atlantic. Natural gas pipelines from Norwegian continental shelf fields transit the affected zone. In the event of a Storegga scale collapse today, the tsunami warning time for the Scottish coast would be approximately 2 hours. The question is not whether another collapse will occur. The geological record shows clearly that they do occur, on a timescale relevant to human civilization. The question is whether the accumulation is already underway. Number 5. The 8.2 kiloyear event. In 1997, geochemist Gerard Bond at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory published a paper in Science that the oceanographic community found deeply unsettling. Bond had been analyzing ice cores from Greenland and sediment cores from the North Atlantic seabed, and he had identified a pattern. Every 1,470 years, give or take, the North Atlantic experienced a significant cooling event, a disruption in ocean circulation that briefly but measurably altered climate across the northern hemisphere. Bond's cycle described a recurring instability in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of ocean currents that transports warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic and, in the process, keeps northern Europe habitable. The largest disruption in Bond's record occurred approximately 8,200 years ago. In approximately 6,200 BCE, the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive remnant of the last glacial maximum covering much of North America, experienced a catastrophic partial collapse. The glacial lakes it had been holding back since the end of the Ice Age, Lake Agassiz and Lake Ojibwe, in which together contained approximately 163,000 cubic kilometers of freshwater, drained into the North Atlantic within a span estimated at between 1 month and 2 years. 163,000 cubic kilometers. That is roughly the combined volume of the modern Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and all 5 Great Lakes combined, added to the North Atlantic within a human lifetime. The influx of freshwater disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the saltwater density differential that drives the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. The AMOC slowed or partially shut down. Average temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped between 1.5 and 3 degrees Celsius within years. The effects were not confined to the North Atlantic. Monsoon patterns in the Middle East, South Asia, and West Africa shifted simultaneously. Drought conditions spread across the Fertile Crescent. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The standard model treats the 8.2 kiloyear event as an isolated anomaly, a one-time consequence of a one-time event, the drainage of glacial lakes that no longer exist. This framing is incomplete. The drainage event was one time. The AMOC disruption it produced is not. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is not a stable, fixed system. It operates within a bistable framework. It can exist in either an active state or a significantly weakened state, and under sufficient freshwater influx. It can transition between these states rapidly. Bond's record shows that it has done so repeatedly, at roughly 1,470-year intervals, driven by mechanisms that do not require glacial lake drainage. Neolithic farming communities across the Fertile Crescent experienced a 160-year cold period accompanied by drought conditions around 6,200 BCE. Archaeological evidence from sites in Anatolia, the Levant, and northern Iraq shows settlement disruption during this period. Population declines, site abandonment, a shift from intensive agriculture to more mobile subsistence patterns. The farming cultures that had been spreading from Anatolia into Europe slowed their expansion. In some regions, established communities reverted to hunter-gatherer practices for a century or more. The truly disturbing aspect is not what happened 8,200 years ago. It is the current state of the AMOC. In 2023, research published in Nature Climate Change by René van Westen and colleagues at Utrecht University identified early warning signals, tipping point precursors, and measurements of AMOC strength over the past century. The system has been weakening. What is clear from the geological record is that when the AMOC has tipped in the past, it has done so rapidly, with consequences for global climate that arrive without graduated warning. The populations affected by the 8.2 kiloyear event had no record of what was happening. They had no framework for understanding that a geological event in Canada had eliminated their monsoon. We have the record. What we lack is the political infrastructure to act on it before the tipping point is reached. Number 4, Meltwater Pulse 1A. In 1989, oceanographer Richard Fairbanks at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory published a paper in Nature that quietly altered the timeline of human prehistory. Fairbanks had been drilling coral cores from Barbados, coral that grows at known rates, recording sea level in its calcium carbonate structure as precisely as a geological thermometer. The record showed something that the accepted model of post-glacial sea level rise had not predicted. Between approximately 14,600 and 14,000 years before present, global sea levels rose between 16 and 25 meters in under 500 years, not over thousands of years, in 500 years. A rate of rise between 3 and 5 centimeters per year, roughly 10 times faster than the average rate of the entire deglaciation period that preceded it. The event is designated Meltwater Pulse 1A. Its cause has been debated for 3 decades. The most widely accepted model attributes it to the rapid collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet's marine-based sectors during a period of ocean warming. A 2014 study by Peter Clark at Oregon State University, published in Science, supported this model with additional ice core evidence. What the cause was is geologically interesting. What the consequences were is archaeologically catastrophic. At 14,600 years before present, the global human population was distributed primarily along coastlines and river systems, exactly as it is today. This is not a coincidence. Coastal zones provide the highest caloric density environments available to non-agricultural societies, marine protein, freshwater access, and the most moderate climates. The people living in 14,600 BCE were not primitive. Anatomically, modern humans had existed for at least 285,000 years. Upper Paleolithic cultures in Europe and Asia were producing representational art, long-distance trade networks, and complex burial rituals. The Jomon culture in Japan, one of the oldest identified ceramic traditions in the world, dates to at least 16,000 BCE. These were not people without capacity for social complexity. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Every coastal civilization that existed between 14,600 and 14,000 BP is now underwater, not metaphorically, literally. A sea level rise of 16 to 25 meters means that every coastline in the world retreated inland by distances ranging from hundreds of meters to tens of kilometers, depending on continental shelf gradient. The richest, most densely populated environments of the late Pleistocene world are now submerged under an average of 60 to 80 meters of seawater. We cannot excavate them with current technology. We cannot survey them effectively. We cannot know what was built there. What we know is this: the population disruption from Meltwater Pulse 1A was global. Genetic analysis of human populations from this period shows a bottleneck, a reduction in effective population size, occurring at approximately this date across multiple lineages. People died, people moved, the sediment and stone of what they built is now inaccessible. The truly disturbing aspect is what Meltwater Pulse 1A implies about the entire timeline of human prehistory. Archaeologists have reconstructed human history from sites that survived to the present day. Overwhelmingly, these are inland or highland sites, not coastal sites, which is where most people lived. The historical record we have is the record of interior settlements. The record of coastal civilizations, which were, in all probability, the largest and most complex, is gone. Every advancement in coastal communities between 100,000 BP and 14,600 BP that wasn't replicated at inland sites left no trace. Meltwater Pulse 1A didn't just drown cities, it altered what we are capable of knowing about ourselves. And the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets still exist. Their marine-based sectors are still grounded on bedrock below sea level. Ocean temperatures are measurably rising. The conditions that produced Meltwater Pulse 1A are not historical artifacts. They are the direction of the current trend. Number 3, the Younger Dryas. In 2007, a team of 25 researchers, led by Richard Firestone, at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that the geological and archaeological communities found deeply uncomfortable. Analyzing sediment cores, peat bogs, and ice cores from 50 sites across North America and Europe, they identify a thin boundary layer present at virtually all sites at the same stratigraphic horizon, dated to approximately 12,900 years before present. The layer contained magnetic spherules, nanodiamonds, and Lonsdaleite, a form of carbon that can only be produced under the extreme pressure and temperature conditions of a hypervelocity cosmic impact. At multiple sites in North America, the layer coincided precisely with the disappearance of the Clovis culture. The Younger Dryas is the name for the period that followed. A return to near glacial conditions lasting approximately 1,200 years, from 10,900 to 9,700 BCE. Greenland ice cores show that average temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. Greenland ice core data, analyzed at resolution sufficient to track individual years, show the cooling occurred over less than a decade. In some records, within a year. A decade, in geological terms, is instantaneous. The mechanism proposed by Firestone's team and subsequently developed by the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis Research Group is a cosmic body, potentially a fragmented comet, impacting or airburst over the Laurentide ice sheet across North America. The impact did not leave a single crater, consistent with an airburst or fragmented impactor across a broad area. Instead, it distributed its energy across a continent. Biomass burning indicators, charcoal, soot, carbon spherules are present at the boundary layer across North America, at levels consistent with continent-wide wildfires. The resulting particulate loading in the atmosphere, combined with disruption of the North American ice sheet's meltwater contribution, is proposed to have triggered the shutdown of the AMOC and the onset of the 1,200-year cold period. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains contested. Critics point to inconsistencies in spherular distribution and dispute the nanodiamond identification at some sites. Supporters have published multiple confirmatory studies, including a 2018 study in the Journal of Geology by James Kennett at UC Santa Barbara, and colleagues identifying the platinum group element, enrichment signature of a cosmic impact at 24 sites across 3 continents. What is not debated is that the Younger Dryas cooling occurred, that it was abrupt, and that it coincided with the disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America. The Clovis people were the earliest securely identified human inhabitants of the Americas. Their distinctive fluted spear points appear abruptly in the archaeological record approximately 13,000 years ago and disappear at 12,900 years ago. Simultaneously, 35 genera of North American megafauna went extinct: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, American lions, camels, horses. An entire ecosystem was erased. The large-bodied fauna of North America did not recover. The ecological complexity that had supported these species did not reassemble in its original form. What replaced the Clovis culture in the archaeological record is sparser, more dispersed, and technologically simpler. The truly disturbing aspect is the present-day implication of the impact hypothesis. If a fragmented comet produced the Younger Dryas, then the mechanism is not one-time. Fragmenting comets return. The torrid meteor stream, which crosses Earth's orbital path twice yearly, contains objects estimated at between 100 meters and several kilometers in diameter. Researchers William Napier and Victor Klube at Oxford have proposed that the torrid stream is a fragmented comet, and that Earth's orbital intersection with its densest particle concentrations peaks on a recurrent cycle. The astronomical community has not reached consensus on this. The geological record of what a similar event produced 12,900 years ago is not ambiguous. An ecosystem of 35 megafauna species and a human culture, were erased in a stratigraphic layer thin enough to miss without careful sampling. That is what complete erasure looks like. Number 2, the Toba catastrophe. In 1998, population geneticist Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois published a paper in the Journal of Human Evolution that proposed an answer to one of the most troubling questions in human genetics. Why does our species show so little genetic diversity? Homo sapiens, despite occupying every continent and numbering in the billions, displays far less genetic variation than would be expected for a species of our range and population size. A single troop of chimpanzees in West Africa contains more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans on Earth. Something Ambrose proposed had nearly eliminated us, and had done so recently enough that we hadn't had time to recover our genetic diversity. His candidate, the Toba supervolcano, which erupted approximately 74,000 years ago on the island of Sumatra. Toba is the largest known volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years. The eruption expelled an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, roughly 5,000 times the volume ejected by Mount St. Helens in 1980. The volcanic explosivity index places it at 8, the highest defined on the scale. The caldera created by the eruption is 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. It is now Lake Toba, the largest volcanic lake on Earth. The immediate destructive radius covered much of Southeast Asia. Ash from the eruption has been found in sediment cores from the Bay of Bengal to the Arabian Sea, in layers up to 9 meters thick in parts of India, more than 3,000 kilometers from the eruption site. The global atmospheric effect is estimated to have produced a volcanic winter lasting 3 to 6 years, during which average global temperatures dropped between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius. In the northern hemisphere, the temperature reduction would have been substantially larger. Photosynthesis was suppressed across most of the planet's surface for years. The vegetation bases of entire ecosystems collapsed simultaneously. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The standard model presents Toba as a disaster of the distant past, catastrophic, but survived. What it understates is how close the margin was. Genetic analysis using coalescent models, mathematical reconstructions of ancestral population, sizes from modern DNA, places the human population bottleneck coinciding with Toba at between 3,000 and 10,000 reproducing individuals. Some estimates are lower. A 2010 study by Peter Henn and colleagues at Stanford, examining variation in the human genome, produced a minimum effective population size estimate of approximately 1,000 individuals at the post-Toba nadir. 1,000 individuals. That is a population small enough to fit in a single high school gymnasium. Every human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from the survivors of Toba. Their genetic contribution is in our cells. Whatever humanity was before Toba is gone. Anatomically, modern humans had existed for at least 226,000 years before the Toba eruption. Over those 226,000 years, they had developed language, art, trade networks, and burial rituals. The knowledge, the cultural traditions, the accumulated technologies of 226,000 years of human development, all of it filtered through a bottleneck of, at most, a few thousand people. The truly disturbing aspect is what this implies about what came before. The oldest currently accepted evidence of anatomically modern human behavior, intentional ochre use, shell beads, early abstract symbolism, dates to approximately 165,000 BCE. That is 91,000 years before Toba. In those 91,000 years, the human brain was fully modern in anatomical terms. There is no biological reason, none, why the cognitive capacity that produced Chauvet Cave or Göbekli Tepe could not have produced complex, city-scale civilization in 100,000 BCE. If it did, Toba eliminated it so completely that no trace has been found. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. It is the signature of what complete erasure looks like. And Sumatra still sits above the same magmatic system. The Toba caldera is classified as a resurgent caldera. Its floor has risen measurably since monitoring began. Number 1, the Laschamp Geomagnetic Excursion. In 1969, French geophysicists studying volcanic rocks in the Laschamp lava flow in the Auvergne region of France discovered something that contradicted every assumption about the stability of Earth's fundamental physical systems. The volcanic rocks, solidified between 41,000 and 42,000 years ago, recorded the direction of Earth's magnetic field at the time of their formation. The field they recorded was pointing south, not toward magnetic south as it does today, toward geographic south. Earth's magnetic poles had reversed. The Laschamp event was not a full magnetic reversal. Those take thousands of years to complete. It was a geomagnetic excursion, a temporary rapid deflection of the magnetic field to a new orientation, lasting approximately 800 years, from about 42,300 to 41,500 years before present. During this 800-year period, Earth's magnetic field strength dropped to less than 6% of its current value. The magnetosphere, the invisible shield generated by the magnetic field that deflects charged particles from the sun, effectively collapsed. Earth was exposed to the full flux of solar and cosmic radiation for 800 years. The biological and climatic consequences of this exposure are documented in sediment cores, ice cores, and the paleontological record. Cosmogenic isotopes, atoms produced by the interaction of cosmic radiation with Earth's atmosphere, including beryllium-10 and chlorine-36, show a dramatic spike in deposition rates 42,000 years ago, consistent with a collapse of the magnetospheric shield. The increase in ionizing radiation reaching Earth's surface during this period has been estimated at between a 5% and 16% increase in UV radiation at ground level, sufficient to produce significant increases in cancer risk and to disrupt plant photosynthesis at the margins of viable light spectrums. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. A 2021 paper in Science, led by Alan Cooper at the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute and Chris Turney at the University of New South Wales, integrated the Laschamp Geomagnetic record with paleontological and archaeological data to produce what they called the Adams event. Their analysis showed that the Laschamp event coincided precisely with the extinction of the megafauna of Australia, the extinction of Neanderthals across Europe, the onset of cave art in Europe. The Chauvet cave paintings are dated to approximately 37,000 BCE, within the recovery period following the excursion. A major climate disruption, visible in Antarctic ice cores, and evidence of increased volcanic activity across multiple regions. The Adams event hypothesis proposes that the collapse of the magnetosphere triggered cascading atmospheric and climatic disruptions that simultaneously eliminated two human populations, Neanderthals and the Denisovan communities of mainland Asia, along with the Australian megafauna. The truly disturbing aspect is not what happened 42,000 years ago. It is what is happening now. Earth's magnetic North Pole is currently moving towards Siberia at a rate of approximately 50 to 60 kilometers per year, a rate that has accelerated measurably since the 1990s. The South Atlantic anomaly, a region of weakened magnetic field strength over South America and the South Atlantic, has been expanding and deepening since its identification in the 20th century. Satellites passing through the South Atlantic anomaly experience elevated rates of electronic component failure from cosmic ray exposure. This is not a projection. It is a current, documented operational problem for satellite operators. Geomagnetic excursions, temporary partial reversals like the Laschamp event, are not predictable from current magnetospheric models. They can begin without warning, transition through their minimum intensity phase within years to decades, and last for centuries to millennia. The last full geomagnetic reversal occurred approximately 780,000 years ago. The last excursion occurred 42,000 years ago. The paleontological record of that excursion shows that the species most dependent on consistent environmental parameters, megafauna, Neanderthals, Denisovans, were the ones that disappeared. The species that survived did so by adapting rapidly, by using technology to buffer against environmental disruption. The magnetosphere is currently weakening. The poles are currently moving at unprecedented documented rates. No early warning system for geomagnetic excursions exists. The geological record does not show them arriving gradually. It shows them arriving, and then it shows what was lost. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.